Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show that's all about the translation of Bloodborne. Today we're just gonna dive right in and see what this old woman has to say.
How did we ever get into this mess?
You're asking the wrong person. You don't seem like you're doing too well.
Oh, the good old days. What are they?
I hope you feel better soon. In the meantime, though, let's take some time to analyze that translation. And, as usual, there are a couple points here that I think it's important to bring up. First, I'd like to note that I think this is another great example of how the game is using natural-sounding phrases to get across the main point of the Japanese in a better way than a simple literal translation. Both of the intelligible lines this woman delivers make for good examples of this. First, there's the line where the woman wonders to herself what the process was that led to things becoming as bad as they are. This lends itself pretty much perfectly to the phrase, "How did we ever get into this mess?" So I think its use here is only fitting, accurately getting across the same idea as the original Japanese in a way that sounds entirely natural to an English speaker. Then there's the second line she has where she reflects on how the past was good and how much fun it used to be. And here I think both of the set phrases really fit the ideas being expressed perfectly. Rather than have the woman say, "Oh, things used to be so much better," or "Oh, everything used to be so grand," or something along those lines, she simply makes reference to the good old days. This, I think, gets at just the level of nostalgia the old woman is slipping into. As we'll see as we continue to interact with her, from this point on, her character is going to engage less with the present and focus more on a happier past, avoiding the harsh reality of the present situation any way she can. As a result, rather than have her draw a comparison, however inadvertent, to the present, she's focused exclusively on a better time that may or may not have even been real. This, I think, is nicely accentuated by her use of the phrase, "the good old days" here, and extended by her next line of, "what a laugh." Again, this sequence could have been rendered something along the lines of, "Oh, everything used to be so grand, it was all so much fun." And that wouldn't have been bad, but I don't think it quite captures the level of caprice you get in the phrase, "what a laugh," or the potential connotations that phrase has of how unbelievable that old time seems now. Finally, that same phrase, "what a laugh," naturally fits with the old woman ending her line by saying, "eh?" which I think is a nice reflection of the Japanese. In the original, this line ends with "ne," which in this case serves basically the same purpose as the English "eh?" soliciting agreement from the listener while at the same time potentially serving as a way to muse to oneself. And part of the reason I like this is because it doesn't always make sense to include a spoken equivalent of the Japanese "ne" at the end of a sentence. Often it's something that has to be replicated in the overall tone of the translated text, but the fact that it can be naturally recreated in the English here I think is a nice touch. So that's all I have to say about the old woman's lines that are actually intelligible. But as you may have noticed, a good deal of her dialogue this time around was made up purely of sounds that the woman never formed into coherent thoughts. You might call them a mix between a kind of sobbing and a kind of laughing. You may also have noticed that though I didn't include any literal translation during these laughing fits, there was still Japanese text being displayed on screen. This is the other thing I wanted to bring up, because Japanese is a language that lends itself much more to expressing things through onomatopoeia than English, and this can frequently be an issue when it comes to translation. Now, this particular case is relatively straightforward, since the sound being expressed by the Japanese is basically just a string of hee 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 over and over and over again, and it's a line that's going to be voiced rather than one that will appear purely as text. But even so, the question of interpretation remains. So try and keep that in mind as I check in with Gilbert again here.
Have I heard of Bergenworth? Afraid I can't say that I have. The locals aren't apt to share any local history. I'm afraid I may not be of help for much longer.
Yeah, that cough is sounding worse.
I know nothing of a bargain worth. And I'm afraid I may not be of help for much longer.
So what we got with the old woman as a laugh is kind of replicated here with Gilbert as a cough. You can see the Japanese subtitles there that essentially just mean cough, cough, cough. And as I've noted before, the general solution it seems like the game has taken to these situations, especially when it comes to sounds made by voiced characters, is to not include anything in the way of English subtitles, but to simply let the character you're interacting with make the sound in question. For the most part, I think this is an elegant solution, though as I've noted before, there's at least one instance with the doll bringing up what is an empty dialogue box in the English as she makes sleeping noises that I take issue with. But even with that as an option, there's the question of interpretation that I ended with before. How does an actor or actress read a line that literally consists of hee hee hee, hee 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 hee? What is this onomatopoeia in the Japanese trying to express? Honestly, it's another example of how much voice acting can lend to a game, and another reminder that there's more to the localization process than mere translation. Because it's one thing to write the phrase maniacal laughter in a script, and another thing entirely to hear that laughter performed. While we're on the subject of sounds and onomatopoeia though, there was one line in Gilbert's dialogue that I think makes for an interesting example of another way these sorts of considerations can influence translation and localization. As listed before, a more literal translation of Gilbert's final line might be, "I'm sorry, it seems I can't be of any help to you anymore." But why exactly might Gilbert not be of any more help to us? Two explanations seem readily apparent. First, there's the fact that he admittedly knows nothing of Bergenworth and isn't likely to find out anything about it from the locals. And second, there's the fact that his illness seems to be progressing. Now, looking only at the lines Gilbert speaks, that first interpretation seems much more likely to me, especially when you consider how the Japanese is phrased more like an established fact, as opposed to the official translation's orientation more towards the future. But when you consider the last thing Gilbert does before he speaks this line is a great deal of coughing, and indeed that the next thing he does is cough some more, suddenly the context is a bit different. It makes it seem like a real possibility that Gilbert is considering his own frailty as he says this. It also ties into a line he's spoken to us before about being able to die human. So basically, the added context of the sound of Gilbert coughing is enough in this case to influence the interpretation of the succeeding line, one that also ties back into ideas the character has expressed before. It's an interesting way for non-spoken information to influence a translation choice. But another thing I think it's worth noting in the representation of these non-spoken sounds is the Japanese depiction itself. I've talked before about how noises such as laughter and coughing are listed out in the Japanese subtitles, but that isn't always the case. Some sounds are listed purely as a series of ellipses in the Japanese subtitles, resulting in a very similar approach to that taken by the English translation. And wouldn't you know it, there's a pretty good example of this right here. Sorry, could you repeat that? Are you sure you're okay? Did you just say bagok? Are you even still human in there? Right, well, let's hope for the best. I have to say though, I am interested in how all of those inhuman sounds were listed as ellipses in the Japanese. Let's check in on the neighbor across the way.
Stop right there. Not an inch closer.
That didn't sound too good. We did get an example of all three types of sound though. That guy started out with a cry that got represented in the subtitles as "ah," then spoke a brief set of lines, then cry out again along with some heavy thumping noises that this time were represented as ellipses. What seems to be going on in the Japanese subtitles then is that clear, normal sounds are being represented as onomatopoeia, while other sounds that are either inhuman or meant to be difficult to discern are listed only as ellipses. It'll be interesting to try and track that as I continue to play through the game. The other thing to point out here is the parallel between this guy's lines and the lines of the woman in the cathedral ward from the last episode, both of which request that someone stay away. I noted before with the woman how I liked the way the translation preserves some ambiguity as far as who she's addressing. Technically that same ambiguity is present here, though the lines are basic enough that preserving it is less difficult. Also, given the ambient noises we hear coming from the man's house, I actually think it's a bit clearer in his case that he's not addressing the player character. He seems to be talking to someone or something in his house, though whatever he's addressing doesn't sound like it's listening anymore. Interesting how once again we have simple sounds and background noises serving as our context for putting together this situation, and how it can influence our interpretation of events. After all, those sounds are the main difference between those two situations. But let's see how this person's doing.
Poor you! Poor you!
Poor me, at least I'm not losing my mind. But anyway, we're once again seeing here that laughter, even crazed laughter, is still being represented in the subtitles. In this case, the Japanese is basically ee-hee-hee-hee-hee. Having noted that then, the other nice thing about this particular set of lines is how well I think both languages managed to echo the previous set of lines this woman spoke while sounding shorter and more crazed. In English, the last time this woman said something to us, it was, "Ah, you poor, poor thing," and then she broke off into laughter. Now that laughter has grown twisted, and all she says is, "Poor you, poor you." In Japanese, her last line is, "Ah, kawaisou ni ne," before she breaks off into laughter, while this time she just says, "Kawaisou ni," and the representation of her laughter is shown to be different as well. The result is that in both languages she comes off almost like a deranged echo of her former self, and I think this makes for a nice touch. Certainly the effect of the official translation is much more striking and really true to the original than if this line had been represented more literally as, "How pitiful, how pitiful." But speaking of pitiful things, we still have one more door to knock on. Sorry, I missed that. What? Is that a scream? Yes, it seems it was supposed to be a scream. For whatever reason, every time I try to knock on this door, I get what I presume is a glitch. There's a brief moment where the Japanese subtitle is shown, there's no sound, and then the dialogue is over. For what it's worth, the Japanese subtitle shown is simply, "Ah," which is why I presume it's supposed to be some sort of scream. It may also be worth noting that this subtitle was not in the form of a string of ellipses, though it's hard to say how important of an observation that is without being able to actually hear the line. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, I haven't been able to get any characters to that particular house at that point in the game and successfully hear the dialogue in either Japanese or English, so that's going to have to remain a mystery for now. The good news is that after 3 episodes of backtracking, we're almost done checking in on people to talk to. Next time we'll start by chatting a bit with the doll, then progress a little ways down a side path involving a familiar character and an item description, and from there we'll only have a couple more quick stops to make before we can actually begin pushing forward into the Forbidden Woods. Hopefully you're looking forward to that as much as I am, because it's just on the other side of the forest that I feel the game really starts to come into its own. For now though, I think it's time to bring this episode to a close. So, let me conclude with another reminder that as always, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for me, I would love to hear them. Thanks for watching everyone.